The little black girl asked the biker for help after workers cornered her, accusing her of sabotaging equipment. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Imagine a peaceful afternoon at a construction site in the middle of a bustling city. The workers are busy with their tasks, machines running, and the sounds of hard labor fill the air. But for one young girl, this was not a normal day. She was about to face an accusation that would change everything. A little black girl, no older than 10, was suddenly surrounded by a group of workers. The air was thick with tension as they pointed fingers and raised their voices. "You sabotaged the equipment," one of the men shouted. The girl stood frozen, her wide eyes filled with fear. She didn't understand what was happening. She had only been trying to help, but now she was being accused of something she didn't do. The workers' voices grew louder, their anger palpable. The girl's heart raced as she backed away, but they closed in on her. Desperate, she turned and ran, her small feet barely touching the ground as she darted through the maze of machinery. Her only thought was to escape the fear and the anger that surrounded her. With no place to go, she spotted a small group of bikers nearby. They were standing outside a rundown diner, their leather jackets glinting in the sun, their motorcycles parked in a neat line. Without thinking, the girl ran towards them, her breath ragged and her chest heaving with each step. As she approached, she cried out, "Please, help me. They're accusing me of something I didn't do. They said I broke the equipment." The bikers, who were quietly enjoying their break, turned their heads as the girl reached them. They looked at each other, sensing the urgency in her voice. One of the bikers, a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and a thick beard, stepped forward. His name was Jack, and he was the leader of the group. Hey, calm down," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "What happened? Who's accusing you of what?" The girl's eyes were filled with tears as she tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They said I broke the machine. I didn't do it. I just wanted to help. They're going to call the cops. Please, you have to stop them." Jack's expression softened as he listened to her. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't let this go. The bikers weren't the type to get involved in matters like this, but something about this situation tugged at his heart. "All right," Jack said, standing up. "We're going to help you. Don't worry, kid. You're safe now." He turned to his crew. "Let's go. We're going to talk to these workers and find out what's going on." The bikers, who had been lounging around, immediately sprang into action. They mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life, and followed Jack as he led the way back to the construction site. The workers were still gathered around the girl, their angry voices rising in the air. As the bikers rolled up, they formed a wall of leather and steel, blocking the workers' path. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" he asked. "What's all this noise about?" The workers looked up, surprised to see the bikers. One of them, a tall man with a tattoo on his neck, sneered and said, "This girl broke our equipment. We're just trying to figure out what happened." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Did she really break the equipment, or are you just blaming her?" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the girl standing behind the bikers. "She was in the area when it happened. We just thought." "You thought what?" Jack interrupted, his voice sharp. "You thought a little girl was the one who broke your equipment? That's a pretty big accusation. Why don't we all take a step back and figure out what really happened here?" The workers looked at each other, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack's crew stood tall, ready to protect the girl, and the workers began to back off. The situation was far from over, but, for the first time, the little girl felt like someone was on her side. The workers hesitated, caught off guard by the bikers' unexpected intervention. For a moment, the construction site seemed frozen in time. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack stood tall, his broad shoulders and stern expression commanding attention. He wasn't a man used to being challenged, especially when it came to protecting a child. "I want to know exactly what happened here," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "You're accusing this little girl of breaking your equipment. But before anyone calls the cops or makes any assumptions, let's take a step back and hear the story. We don't want any misunderstandings." The workers looked at each other, their expressions shifting from anger to uncertainty. The tall man with the neck tattoo stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable. "She was right there when the machine broke down," he muttered, pointing toward the construction equipment a few yards away. "We just assumed." "You assumed?" Jack interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "You're making an assumption about a little girl? That's a pretty big leap, don't you think?" The man faltered, not expecting such a direct challenge. He looked around at the other workers, who were now avoiding eye contact. Jack could see their confidence waning. The girl, who had been standing behind the bikers this entire time, shifted nervously. She was still holding onto the sleeve of Jack's jacket, her small hand trembling. Jack turned to her, crouching down so that he was at eye level. "Hey," he said softly, "don't worry. We've got this." The girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand, nodding. Her name was Emily, and she had been working at the site with her mother for the past few months. Her mother was the cleaning lady, and Emily helped out when she could. The workers, however, had been treating her like an outsider, and when the equipment broke, they turned on her. Emily didn't know what happened, but she knew that the machine had been acting strange all morning. She had been near it when it stopped working, but she had done nothing to break it. "I didn't touch anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear." Jack's heart went out to her. He could see that she was telling the truth. No child, especially one this young, would have the wherewithal to sabotage expensive equipment on a construction site. The workers, now realizing the gravity of their accusation, began to shift uncomfortably. One of the older workers, a middle-aged man with a worn face, spoke up. "I don't think she did it on purpose," he said quietly. "But we don't know who else was around. It could have been anyone." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Right. It could have been anyone," he said, emphasizing the word anyone. "But that doesn't mean you can just point the finger at the first person you see. This girl didn't deserve to be accused like that." The older man shifted, clearly uneasy, but didn't argue further. Jack stood up, his eyes sweeping over the group of workers. He could tell they were starting to understand that they had made a serious mistake. But the situation wasn't over yet. Emily was still in danger. Her reputation had already been damaged, and it was clear that some of the workers were still looking at her with suspicion. Jack couldn't let that slide. "We're taking Emily with us," Jack said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "We'll figure this out. But she's not staying here. Not after being treated like this." The workers didn't argue. They knew they had been wrong, and Jack's presence was enough to make them back down. As Jack turned to Emily, he could see the relief flooding her face. She had been terrified, not just by the accusation, but by the fear of being abandoned and left to face the consequences on her own. Now, she had a group of bikers on her side. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now, Emily. We've got you." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines rumbling to life, creating a symphony of power and determination. Emily climbed onto Jack's bike, clutching onto him tightly. The rest of the bikers followed in formation, engines roaring as they made their way out of the construction site. The workers stood still, watching as the group of bikers disappeared into the distance. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on them, and for the first time, they were left to reflect on their actions. Jack led the way, his focus unwavering as he glanced back at Emily, who now seemed a little more at ease. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The situation was far from over, and there were still many questions to be answered. But one thing was clear, Emily was no longer alone. And with the bikers on her side, no one would be able to hurt her again. The bikers rode in silence, their engines humming in unison as they made their way through the winding streets of the city. Jack led the way, his mind focused, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Emily, still clutching onto him tightly, looked up at the sky, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She had been terrified when the workers had cornered her, accusing her of something she hadn't done, but now, as the cool wind rushed past them, she felt a sense of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Jack's bike rumbled beneath her, and she could feel the power of the machine, but more than that, she felt safe, protected by the strong presence of the bikers around her. They had promised to help, and they were keeping that promise. As they rode, Jack kept his eye on the rearview mirror, making sure the workers hadn't followed them. The construction site had been tense, but it wasn't over yet. The workers might be embarrassed about what had happened, but that didn't mean they wouldn't cause more trouble. Jack knew he couldn't let his guard down. Emily didn't say much, but Jack could tell that she was still shaken by the events of the day. Every now and then, he'd glance down at her, offering a reassuring smile. She was brave, but even the bravest kids could get scared when they were caught in a situation like that. After a while, they reached the outskirts of the city. Jack led the group into a quiet neighborhood, far from the busy streets and noise of the construction site. He slowed his bike down as they pulled into the parking lot of an old but well-maintained building. It was a small, private clubhouse where the bikers often gathered. Jack had called ahead, and the others were already there, waiting for them. As the bikers parked their motorcycles, Emily looked around in awe. She had never seen anything like this before. The clubhouse was big, with a large garage where the bikes were stored. It had a warm, welcoming atmosphere, and the sounds of laughter and talking could be heard coming from inside. Jack helped Emily off the bike and guided her into the clubhouse. Inside, the atmosphere was relaxed, but there was a sense of purpose in the air. The other bikers had gathered around a table, talking in low voices. Some were cleaning their bikes, while others were preparing food and drinks. The scent of freshly cooked food filled the room, and Emily's stomach growled. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Sit down, kid," Jack said, leading her to a chair. "Get some food and relax. You're safe here." Emily smiled weakly, grateful for the kindness. She had never felt so at ease. The bikers were rough around the edges, but they were kind. She could tell that they were family to each other, and now, they were making her feel like part of that family too. As she sat down to eat, Jack went over to the table where the other bikers were gathered. He needed to make a plan. The situation with the workers was just the beginning. He could sense that there was more going on here, something deeper than just a simple misunderstanding. Emily's story didn't add up, and Jack wasn't the type to let things go without digging a little deeper. "We need to find out who these workers are," Jack said, his voice low. "Who do they work for? And why was that little girl caught in the middle of all this?" One of the bikers, a tall man with a deep voice, looked up from his meal. "You think someone's pulling strings?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Could be," Jack replied. "It doesn't sit right with me. She was targeted, and we need to find out why." The others nodded in agreement. They all knew that Jack wasn't one to take things lightly, especially when it came to protecting kids. "We'll handle it," said another biker, a woman with short, dark hair and a tough exterior. "We've got connections, and we know how to get information." Jack gave her a nod of approval. "I know, but we need to be careful. We don't want to stir up trouble without knowing who we're dealing with." The bikers spent the next few hours planning their next move. Jack made a few calls, checking in with some of the club's contacts. They learned that the workers on the site were part of a larger construction company, one with a reputation for being cutthroat. The company had a history of shady dealings, but nothing that had ever been proven. Jack could feel the pieces starting to fall into place. There was more to this than just a simple accusation. The bikers didn't have all the answers yet, but they were determined to get them. Emily, now full from the meal, sat quietly in the corner, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion finally caught up with her. She had been through so much in such a short time, but for the first time in days, she felt like she could finally rest. As the night wore on, the bikers continued to work, making plans and gathering information. They weren't going to let this go. Not now. Not when a child was involved. Jack stood up, looking around at his crew. "Tomorrow, we find out what's really going on," he said, his voice firm. "And we make sure Emily gets the justice she deserves." The room fell silent for a moment, each biker nodding in agreement. They weren't just doing this for Emily anymore. They were doing it because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, the bikers gathered in the clubhouse, their faces a mixture of determination and quiet resolve. Jack stood at the front, looking over his crew. Emily was sitting at the table, her head resting against her arms, the exhaustion from the previous day finally catching up with her. She had been through so much, but now she had a moment of peace, surrounded by the bikers who had promised to protect her. Jack knew that peace was temporary. They still had a mission to complete. "All right," Jack said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "We've got some work to do today. We know who the workers are, and we've got a lead on the company they're working for. We need to find out exactly what's going on before we make any more moves." The bikers nodded in unison. This wasn't going to be a simple investigation. There were layers to this situation, and Jack knew they had to tread carefully. The company, as they had learned, had a history of unethical practices. But even worse, it seemed like someone in the company had a personal vendetta against Rick, Emily's father. Jack was piecing things together in his mind. The Serpents, the gang Rick had once ridden with, had been involved in a federal case. Rick had testified against their leader, a man named Viper Santana, and it seemed like the Serpents had somehow found out about it. Jack's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from his contact at the local police station. "They've got Rick. They're looking for him," the message read. Jack's stomach tightened. He knew this was coming. The Serpents weren't going to let Rick slip away without paying the price for turning on them. Jack looked up at his crew, his eyes hardening. "We need to move now," he said. "The Serpents have Rick, and if they think they can get away with this, they're wrong." The bikers jumped into action. They gathered their gear, checked their bikes, and mounted up. The engines roared to life, shaking the ground beneath them. Jack, as always, led the charge, with Emily riding behind him. She had been quiet all morning, but now she seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Jack could feel her hands gripping him tighter, but he didn't say anything. He knew she was scared. They all were. As they made their way through the streets, Jack's mind raced. The Serpents were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. But they had underestimated one thing: the loyalty of the Thunder Wolves. Jack had promised to protect Emily, and he wasn't about to break that promise. The bikers cut through the city, heading toward the industrial district where the Serpents were believed to be hiding out. The road stretched before them, a long, winding path that seemed to go on forever. The wind whipped through Jack's hair as they sped down the highway, but his focus never wavered. He had a job to do. They arrived at an old warehouse, the kind of place that looked abandoned but was still used for illegal activity. The Serpents had set up shop there, and Jack knew they needed to be careful. He signaled for the bikers to slow down as they approached the building. The area was quiet, too quiet. Jack's instincts were on high alert. "Stay sharp," Jack muttered into his radio, his voice low. The bikers spread out, taking positions around the building. Jack and Emily stayed at the back, keeping their distance. They could hear voices from inside, muffled but clear enough to make out that Rick was there. Jack's heart clenched. He didn't know how long they had before things escalated. They had to act fast. Jack motioned for the bikers to move in. As they approached the door, Jack kicked it open, the sound echoing through the warehouse. The Serpents inside froze, caught off guard. The leader, Viper Santana, stood at the center of the room, his cold eyes narrowing as he saw the bikers enter. Well, Viper said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If it isn't the Thunder Wolves." "What's the matter, Jack? Did you miss me?" Jack didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Let Rick go," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're messing with." Viper chuckled darkly. "I know exactly what I'm messing with," he said, his eyes flicking to Emily. "And I've got more than just Rick to worry about now, don't I?" Jack's blood ran cold. He could tell that Viper was trying to provoke him, but he wasn't going to let it work. He nodded to his crew, signaling them to take positions around the room. The bikers were ready. "Let him go, Viper," Jack repeated. "You're out of your league here." Viper's smile faded, replaced with a steely glare. "I don't take orders from you, Jack," he said. "But I'll make you a deal. You leave now, and I'll let Rick go. Stay, and we'll see how long you last." Jack took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jack knew he couldn't back down. He couldn't let Viper win. The bikers tightened their grips on their weapons, waiting for Jack's signal. "This is your last chance, Viper," Jack said. "Let him go, or we're taking him back ourselves." Viper hesitated, his eyes flicking from Jack to Emily, and then back to his crew. The room held its breath. This was the moment that would decide everything. The tension in the room was thick as Jack and Viper stood face to face, the standoff hanging in the balance. Viper's eyes flicked to Emily, a cruel smile curling on his lips as if he had already won. Jack's hand tightened around the handle of his knife, but he stayed focused, his gaze unwavering. Emily, sitting quietly by Jack's side, felt a strange sense of calm despite the chaos unfolding around her. She knew the bikers were ready, but her mind kept returning to one thought: her father. He was somewhere out there, in danger, and this was all because of what had happened years ago. Jack's voice cut through the silence. "You're making a big mistake, Viper. Let Rick go." and this doesn't have to go any further. Viper's grin never wavered. You think you're in control here, Jack? You're just a bunch of washed-up bikers trying to play hero. But I'm running the show now. He gestured to the men around him, his voice rising. These are my people. You're in my world now. Jack's jaw clenched. He knew that Viper was trying to goad him into making a move, but he wasn't going to fall for it. Not yet. You're not going to get away with this, Jack said, his voice steady but firm. You've already lost. Viper paused, his eyes narrowing as he weighed Jack's words. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tension would break. But then Viper's expression darkened, and he turned to one of his men. Get Rick, he ordered. The biker, a tall and wiry man, moved swiftly across the room to where Rick was tied up, still unconscious. The room fell silent as the man brought Rick forward, shoving him roughly to the floor. Rick groaned, slowly coming to, his eyes fluttering open as he saw the bikers surrounding him. His gaze locked with Jack's, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. You made it, Rick whispered hoarsely, his voice ragged from the ordeal. Jack nodded. We're getting you out of here, he said, his voice low but resolute. But as they prepared to move, Viper's voice rang out again, sharp and demanding. Not so fast, he sneered. You think you can just walk in here and take him? I don't think so, Jack. The tension exploded as Viper's men moved forward, weapons in hand. The bikers instinctively reached for their own, the clink of metal filling the air as everyone braced for a fight. Jack stepped in front of Emily, his body blocking her from the chaos that was about to unfold. Stay back, he told her, his voice hard but protective. Emily nodded, her heart racing, but she trusted him. She trusted all of them. The standoff was only getting worse. Viper's men closed in, their eyes burning with malice, while the bikers remained calm, their fingers hovering over their weapons. Jack knew they were outnumbered, but it didn't matter. They weren't backing down. You want to fight? Jack asked, his voice cold. Fine. But know this. If you harm Rick or any of us, you're signing your own death warrant. Viper smirked. You're talking big, Jack. But words don't scare me. He signaled to his men, and within seconds, the room was filled with the sound of chaos. The bikers and the Serpents clashed in a blur of fists and steel, the sound of bodies hitting the floor and the clash of weapons ringing through the warehouse. Jack fought with everything he had, his fists landing powerful blows as he made his way toward Viper. But the Serpents weren't backing down either. It was a brutal fight, and every second felt like an eternity. Through the mayhem, Jack could see Emily, still sitting by the wall, her eyes wide with fear. His heart clenched as he realized that this fight was bigger than just getting Rick back. It was about making sure Emily was safe. The fight raged on, but slowly, Jack and his crew began to gain the upper hand. Viper's men were starting to fall back, their confidence faltering as they realized they were outmatched. Viper himself stood at the back of the room, watching the battle unfold, his eyes cold and calculating. But Jack wasn't about to let him get away. He made his way toward Viper, his eyes locked on him. This ends now, Jack said, his voice dripping with menace. Viper's smirk faded as Jack advanced. You think you've won? Viper sneered, stepping back. You've got no idea what you're dealing with, Jack. This isn't over. But Jack wasn't listening. He lunged forward, taking Viper down with a swift movement, his hand grabbing Viper's throat. It's over, Jack growled, his grip tightening. Viper struggled, but it was no use. Jack had him pinned, and this time, he wasn't going to let him go. The remaining Serpents looked on, fear creeping into their eyes as they realized their leader was defeated. They knew they were out of options. Slowly, they backed off, retreating from the bikers who stood victorious. As the chaos died down, Jack released his grip on Viper, standing over him. You're done, Jack said coldly, and so is this. He turned to his crew. We're leaving, and we're taking Rick with us. The bikers, battered but unbroken, moved quickly to get Rick out of the warehouse. Jack looked back one last time at Viper, who was now struggling to get up. The Serpents were done, and Jack was certain of that. As they left the building, Emily looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Jack smiled, giving her a reassuring nod. You're safe now, kid. Let's get out of here. The bikers rode out of the warehouse, their engines roaring as they made their way toward freedom. Jack kept his focus ahead, but in the back of his mind, He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. But for now, he had kept his promise, and that was all that mattered. As the bikers rode through the city streets, the morning sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the pavement. The events of the night before still echoed in Jack's mind, but now there was a sense of accomplishment. Rick was safe, Emily was safe, and the threat of the Serpents had been neutralized. For the first time in a long while, Jack allowed himself to breathe, but he knew that this peace wouldn't last. Not while the Serpents were still out there. Jack glanced back at Emily, who was riding behind him, her small frame nestled against his back. She had been through so much, but the weight of the previous day seemed to have lifted. The constant tension in her body was gone, and she had fallen silent, her head resting against Jack's shoulder as they rode. The road stretched out before them, endless and open, and for a moment, it felt like nothing could touch them. But Jack wasn't fooled. He knew that the Serpents had been only the beginning. The real danger was yet to come. As they turned onto the highway leading out of town, Jack's thoughts turned to Rick. His old friend had been through so much, and Jack couldn't help but feel guilty for not being there sooner. He had promised Rick years ago that he would always be there to protect his family, but it had taken too long to make good on that promise. Jack pushed those thoughts aside. There was no time for guilt now. They had to keep moving, stay one step ahead of whatever the Serpents had planned next. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, hoping it wasn't more bad news. The screen lit up with a message from one of his contacts in the city. "Viper's not done," the message read. "He's making moves, and he's got people on the inside." Jack's heart sank. He had known that the Serpents weren't finished, but this confirmed his worst fears. Viper's reach was far and wide, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Jack swore under his breath, his grip tightening on the handlebars. "What's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Jack turned his head slightly, offering her a brief smile. "Nothing to worry about, kid," he said, his voice steady. "Just got a little more work to do." Emily didn't press him. She had learned quickly that Jack wasn't one to share his burdens, but she could see the worry in his eyes. She had seen it the night before when he had gone toe-to-toe with Viper and his men. It had taken all of Jack's strength to keep everything under control, but the weight of the situation was clearly taking its toll. They had all seen how far Viper would go to protect his empire, and now it was clear that the Serpents weren't going to let Emily and Rick go without a fight. The group continued down the highway, the sound of their motorcycles filling the air as they headed toward the small town where they planned to lay low for the next few days. It was a small, quiet place, far from the chaos of the city. Jack had chosen it because it was a place where they could regroup, plan their next move, and rest before things got even more complicated. As they entered the town, the streets were empty, the buildings dark and quiet. Jack slowed his bike, making sure they weren't being followed. They didn't stop until they reached a small house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it would do. Jack turned off the engine, and the others followed suit, dismounting and starting to unload their gear. Emily stepped off the bike, her legs still a little unsteady from the long ride, but she was okay. She had been quiet for the past hour, and Jack knew that her mind was racing. She had been through so much in the past few days, and he couldn't imagine what she was feeling. "Let's get inside," Jack said, motioning for her to follow. "We'll be safe here for now." As they walked inside, Emily looked around at the modest furnishings. The house was simple, but it was a place of comfort and safety. There was no more danger lurking in the shadows, at least not here. Jack gave her a nod before turning to the other bikers. "All right, here's the plan," he began, his tone serious. "We lay low for a few days, regroup, and figure out our next move. The Serpents aren't done, and we need to stay one step ahead of them." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. "We'll get Rick back on his feet, and we'll make sure Emily is protected. But we need to be careful. Viper won't stop until he gets what he wants, and we can't let him get to us." The bikers nodded, their faces grim. They all knew what was at stake. They had already fought tooth and nail to get Rick back, but they knew the war was far from over. As the bikers began to settle in and make themselves comfortable, Jack turned to Emily. She was sitting on the couch, her head resting against the back as she stared at the wall, lost in thought. Jack took a seat beside her, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe now, Emily," he said. "But we still have work to do. We're not done yet." Emily didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I know," she said quietly, "but I don't want to lose anyone else." Jack's heart broke at her words. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Not while I'm around." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace. The storm was still coming, but for now, they had a place to rest, a place to plan. And that was all they needed to keep fighting. The following day, the bikers gathered in the small living room of the house, the weight of the situation heavy in the air. Jack paced back and forth, his mind constantly working through the next steps. Emily was sitting quietly in the corner, her head resting against the wall as she gazed out the window, lost in her thoughts. Rick, still recovering from the ordeal, was lying on the couch, his face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Despite the bruises and cuts, he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Jack stopped pacing and turned to face his crew. "All right, here's the plan," he began, his voice firm but calm. "We've got a lot to deal with, and time is running out. Viper isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." The bikers nodded, their faces serious. They had all seen the chaos that Viper and his men had caused, and they knew they couldn't underestimate the danger that was still out there. "We need to find out what Viper is planning," Jack continued. "We can't just sit around and wait for him to make his next move. We need information, and we need it fast." One of the bikers, a tall man with a rugged face, stepped forward. "I can get us some intel," he said, his voice steady. "I've got some contacts in the city, people who owe me favors. I can start asking around, see if anyone knows what Viper is up to." Jack gave him a nod of approval. "Good. Get started on that. We need all the information we can get." Another biker, a woman with short, dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude, spoke up. "What about the rest of us?" she asked. "What do we do while we wait?" Jack paused, thinking for a moment. "We stay ready. Keep our eyes open. We're not going to let Viper catch us off guard. If he makes a move, we need to be ready to hit back." The bikers nodded in agreement. They were a team, and they knew that they could rely on each other when it mattered most. Jack turned to Emily, who had been silent the entire time. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Emily looked up at him, her eyes tired but steady. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Jack could tell she was still processing everything that had happened, but he also knew that she was stronger than she seemed. She had been through so much, and yet she was still standing. "You're safe here," Jack reassured her, offering a small smile. "We'll protect you, I promise." Emily nodded, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in days, Emily felt a sense of peace. She didn't have to worry about the workers or the Serpents, not here. The bikers had given her a sense of security, a place to breathe and heal. As the day wore on, the bikers began to make their preparations. Some of them went out to gather supplies, while others stayed behind to keep watch. Jack was constantly on edge, his mind focused on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to relax, not with Viper still out there. Rick had gotten some rest, but Jack knew that he was still recovering from the brutal encounter with the Serpents. The man had been through hell, and now it was Jack's turn to help him pick up the pieces. Later that evening, the bikers gathered again to discuss what they had learned. One of the men who had been gathering intel returned with some information. "I've got a lead," he said, his voice low. "Viper's been meeting with some of his old associates. Word is, he's planning something big, but no one knows what yet." Jack's brow furrowed. "Something big," he repeated. The man nodded. "Yeah, and it's not just about Rick. Viper's making moves that could put a lot of people in danger." Jack's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Viper wasn't just a threat to them. He was a threat to everyone in his path. "We need to find out exactly what he's planning," Jack said, his voice steely. "And we need to stop it before it's too late." The bikers agreed, and they spent the next few hours putting together a plan. They would have to act fast and move quickly. Time was running out, and Viper was always one step ahead. As they finished making their plans, Jack stood up, his eyes scanning the room. He could see the determination in his crew's eyes, and it gave him hope. They were ready. Jack turned to Emily. "Stay here," he said, his tone soft but serious. "We'll take care of everything. You're safe here, but we're going to need you to be strong." All right. Emily nodded, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. She wanted to help, but Jack wasn't going to put her in any more danger. We'll be back soon, he said, giving her a reassuring smile. As the bikers prepared to leave, Jack's thoughts once again turned to Rick. The man had been through so much, and now it was time for Jack to make sure he stayed safe. But Jack wasn't going to let anything happen to him, not if he could help it. They were family, and family took care of each other. Let's do this, Jack said, his voice low and determined. The bikers mounted their bikes, and the engines roared to life. The sun was setting behind them as they rode off into the distance, ready to face whatever Viper had planned. But Jack knew one thing for sure. They were ready for the fight. The sun was just beginning to set as Jack and his crew rode toward the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The wind rushed past them, a constant reminder of the danger they were riding into. Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had gathered all the information they could, and now it was time to confront Viper and his men. He glanced over at Emily, who was riding behind him. She had remained quiet for most of the ride, her mind likely still processing everything that had happened over the past few days. Jack could tell she was still shaken, but there was a determination in her eyes now. She had come a long way since they had first met, and he was proud of her for how she had handled everything. As they neared the warehouse, Jack could see the lights of several motorcycles parked outside. It wasn't just Viper's crew. There were other bikers here too, and that made Jack uneasy. He knew that Viper was dangerous, but now it seemed like there were even more enemies to contend with. He pulled his bike to a stop, signaling for the others to do the same. Stay close, Jack muttered, his voice low but firm. The bikers dismounted, each of them scanning the area for any sign of movement. Jack took a deep breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. The Serpents were ruthless, and they would do anything to protect their empire. But Jack wasn't about to let them win. We're going in, Jack said, motioning for the others to follow. Keep your heads down and stay alert. The group moved swiftly, making their way toward the warehouse entrance. As they approached, Jack could hear voices coming from inside. The doors were slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip through without being noticed. Jack nodded to the others, and they slipped inside one by one. The warehouse was dimly lit, the shadows cast by the tall, steel beams stretching across the floor. Jack's eyes adjusted quickly, and he saw Viper and his crew gathered in the center of the room, talking in low voices. The air was thick with tension, and Jack knew they were getting closer to the confrontation he had been anticipating. Viper was standing near the back of the room, his back to them, and Jack could see that he was talking to a group of men. Some of them looked like they were new recruits, eager to prove themselves, while others had the hardened look of veterans. Jack motioned for the bikers to spread out, each of them taking a position around the warehouse. They had to move fast and quietly if they were going to catch Viper off guard. As they got closer, Viper turned, his eyes scanning the room. He narrowed his eyes when he saw the bikers creeping closer. Well, he sneered, if it isn't the Thunderwolves. You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with authority. We're not here to play games, Viper, he said. Let Rick go. Now. Viper chuckled, the sound cold and menacing. You think you can make demands here? He asked. I've got more men than you, Jack. You're outnumbered. You're outmatched. Jack didn't flinch. We've taken down worse than you, he said. And we're not leaving without Rick. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men stared each other down. Viper's eyes flicked to the other bikers, sizing them up. He knew they weren't going to back down. His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You think this is just about Rick, don't you? Viper said. This is bigger than that, Jack. It's always been bigger than that. Jack's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Viper laughed darkly. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me or you or Rick. This is about power. The kind of power that you'll never understand. Jack's mind raced. He had heard rumors about Viper's plans, but he had never imagined that it was this big. The Serpents weren't just a gang, they were building an empire. And Jack was standing right in the middle of it. I don't care about your empire, Viper, Jack said. All I care about is getting Rick and Emily out of here safely. And I'm not leaving without them. Viper's expression turned cold. You're a fool, Jack, he said. You'll never get away with this. At that moment, one of Viper's men lunged toward Jack, a knife gleaming in the dim light. But before the man could get close, one of the bikers, a large man named Bear, grabbed him by the arm and slammed him into the ground. "Not today," Bear growled. The room erupted into chaos as the bikers and serpents clashed. The sound of fists hitting flesh, the clash of metal, and the roar of motorcycles filled the air. Jack didn't waste any time. He darted toward Viper, his knife drawn. Viper's men were scrambling now, trying to hold their ground. But the bikers were too quick, too organized. Jack and Viper locked eyes as Jack closed the distance between them. "This ends now." "Viper," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. Viper sneered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew that his time was running out. As Jack lunged forward, Viper stumbled back, his hand reaching for a gun tucked into his waistband. But before he could draw it, Jack was on him, his blade slashing through the air. Viper's hand dropped to the floor, his gun slipping out of his grasp. The battle was over. The Serpents were defeated. The bikers stood victorious, but there was no time to celebrate. Jack turned to Rick, who had been standing at the back, watching the fight unfold. "It's time to go," Jack said. Rick nodded, his face pale but relieved. He had been through hell, but now, it was finally over. The bikers gathered their gear, ready to leave the warehouse. But as Jack looked at Emily, he knew this was only the beginning. They had won this fight, but Viper's empire was far from gone. The road ahead would be just as dangerous, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. The bikers moved quickly through the night, their motorcycles cutting through the cool air like knives. Jack led the group, his mind racing with everything that had happened. They had taken down Viper, but the Serpent's empire wasn't going to crumble that easily. Jack knew they needed to stay on high alert. Emily was riding behind him again, her small hands clutching him tightly as they rode. The wind whipped past them, but she felt a sense of calm, knowing she was safe for now. Jack could feel her tense every time they hit a bump in the road, but she didn't say anything. She was strong, and Jack admired that about her. They had all been through so much, but Emily had kept it together in ways that most adults couldn't. The rest of the bikers followed closely behind, their engines rumbling in unison. It felt like they were riding into a storm, but none of them slowed down. As they neared the outskirts of the town, Jack noticed something strange. The usual silence of the night was broken by the faint sound of sirens in the distance. He slowed his bike, his instincts kicking in. He glanced back at the crew, signaling for them to do the same. "Something's not right," Jack muttered to himself. The sirens were getting closer, but they weren't the kind of sirens that came with routine patrols. These were the loud, persistent wail of a police chase, and that meant trouble. He turned to Emily, his expression hardening. "Stay close," he said. She nodded, her face set with determination. The group stopped near a deserted gas station, its lights flickering in the distance. Jack was about to radio in when one of the bikers, a young man with short, sandy hair, pointed toward the road. "Look," he said, his voice tense. Jack followed his gaze and saw a convoy of black cars speeding down the road, their headlights cutting through the night like predators on the hunt. It didn't take a genius to know that the Serpents were still active, and they had someone powerful helping them. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They had to move fast. "We need to split up," he said, his voice sharp. "You know what to do. Keep your distance, but stay in formation. We're going to find out who's behind this." The bikers nodded in unison. They weren't going to let the Serpents get away with this. They had already come too far to stop now. Jack turned to Emily, giving her a reassuring nod. "Stay behind me, all right? If anything happens, I'll be right there." She nodded silently, her eyes full of trust. They revved their engines, splitting into two groups. Jack and a few others stayed on the main road, following the convoy at a safe distance while the rest of the crew took side streets, circling around to cut off any potential escape routes. The chase was on. They followed the convoy for miles, their motorcycles blending into the shadows as the cars sped down the empty roads. Jack kept his focus on the cars in front of him, but his mind was racing. Who was behind this? And why were they so eager to catch up with the bikers? Jack didn't have the answers yet, but he knew that he was going to get them. After a few tense miles, the convoy finally slowed as they neared an industrial district on the edge of town. The area was dark, with only the faint glow of streetlights and the occasional flicker of neon signs. Jack's gut told him that this was where things were going to get ugly. They had to be careful. Jack signaled for the bikers to hold back as the convoy turned into a large, gated warehouse. It was an old building, clearly abandoned, but the cars pulled in like they knew exactly where they were going. Jack waited for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. He could see shadows moving inside the warehouse, but it was too dark to make out any details. "This is it," Jack said, his voice low. "We need to get in there and find out what they're up to." They moved quietly, parking their bikes a few blocks down, out of sight. The crew stayed close as they approached the warehouse on foot. Jack's mind raced as they neared the entrance. This wasn't just about Rick or Emily anymore. The Serpents had bigger plans, and Jack was going to stop them before they could do any more damage. They reached the side of the building, where an old door creaked on its hinges. Jack motioned for everyone to stay low as they crept closer. He could hear voices inside, faint but growing louder. They were getting closer. Jack slowly pushed the door open, wincing as it groaned. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit room filled with boxes, crates, and old machinery. At the far end of the room, a group of men stood gathered around a table, talking in hushed tones. Jack signaled to the crew, and they spread out, taking cover behind the crates. Jack could hear snippets of their conversation. "Make the move tonight. The boss is waiting, ready to finalize the deal." Jack's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a random meeting. They were planning something big. He needed to know more. Slowly, he moved forward, his eyes locked on the men at the table. As he crept closer, he could see their faces, and his heart sank when he recognized one of them. It was one of Viper's right-hand men, a dangerous figure in the underworld. Jack could feel the heat rise in his chest, his anger boiling. They had been playing a dangerous game, but now it was time to end it. Without warning, Jack stood up and stepped forward, his voice low but filled with authority. "I think it's time you tell me what's really going on," Jack said, his words cutting through the silence. The men froze, their eyes snapping to him. The room went still, the only sound the heavy breathing of the bikers and the faint hum of the warehouse. It was now or never. The room went eerily quiet as Jack's voice echoed through the dimly lit warehouse. The men around the table froze, their eyes locking onto him. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The right-hand man, the one Jack had recognized from Viper's inner circle, narrowed his eyes, but there was no fear. Just calculation. He stood up slowly, his hands moving to his sides, likely ready to pull a weapon if necessary. Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he remained calm. He wasn't here to start a fight, yet. He was here for answers. "You've been busy," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Tell me what's really going on. What's the plan?" The man smirked, clearly not intimidated by Jack's presence. "You think we're just sitting around, Jack?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been riding around in circles, thinking you can stop what's already set in motion. You're too late." Jack's jaw clenched. He knew they were working against the clock. Viper's operation wasn't just a small-time hustle. It was something much bigger, and if they didn't act now, they could lose everything. "What's happening tonight?" Jack pressed, not giving an inch. "What deal is Viper finalizing?" The man took a step closer, his smirk turning into a grin. "You really want to know?" he taunted. Jack didn't flinch. He had to know everything. "Tell me," Jack repeated. The man laughed, then nodded to one of his associates, a large figure in the back of the room. The associate stepped forward, holding up a folder. Jack's eyes locked onto it immediately. "This," the man said, "is what's going down. Viper's not just expanding his territory. He's aligning himself with some powerful people. People who can take his empire to the next level. They're making deals that you can't even begin to understand." Jack's stomach twisted. He knew Viper was dangerous, but this sounded even worse than he had imagined. Viper wasn't just a thug with a gang. He was trying to build a criminal empire with connections that reached far beyond the streets. "Who are these people?" Jack asked, his voice tight. The man hesitated for a moment, but then he shrugged. "Why should I tell you? You're not going to stop it. Viper's already got everything in place. All he needs now is your boy Rick. And he'll have him." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, my boy Rick?" Jack demanded. The man's grin only grew wider. "Viper doesn't forget a debt, Jack. Rick's alive because Viper's using him as leverage. He'll get everything he wants, including Rick, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do to stop him." Jack's hands curled into fists, his blood boiling. He had promised Rick's family he would keep him safe, but now, it seemed like they were up against something far bigger than they could have anticipated. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm not walking away from this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll take down Viper and everyone he's working with. You're wrong if you think this is over." The man sneered. "You've already lost," he said. "The deal's in motion, and there's no going back. You might think you can stop Viper, but you're just a bunch of bikers, Jack. You don't stand a chance against what's coming." Jack felt the weight of those words, but he didn't let them sink in. He couldn't. "Not now. I'm not here to play small," Jack said, his voice filled with cold determination. "I'll burn this whole thing to the ground if I have to." He turned to his crew, who had been standing in the shadows, watching the exchange unfold. "Get ready," Jack said. "We don't leave until we have what we need." The bikers moved quickly, gathering around Jack, their focus sharp. They weren't backing down, not now, not when the stakes were this high. Jack's mind raced as he pieced together the information. They didn't know everything yet, but they had enough to make their next move. Viper wasn't just after Rick. He was after something far bigger, and Jack wasn't about to let him get away with it. The room was still tense, the air thick with hostility. Jack's gaze never left the right-hand man, who was now glaring at him, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. "You're out of your league, Jack," the man spat. "You'll see soon enough." Jack nodded slowly. "We'll see," he replied. He turned to the rest of the bikers, giving them the signal. "Let's move." They left the warehouse, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Jack knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. They had to act fast. They had to get ahead of Viper and find out who was pulling his strings before it was too late. But as they headed back to their bikes, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The Serpents were more dangerous than ever, and now they were being backed by people with real power. They had to strike hard, strike fast, and take down Viper before his empire spread any further. Jack's eyes burned with resolve. "We're going to finish this," he muttered. The bikers revved their engines, the sound filling the air. Jack looked over at Emily, who was waiting by his bike. She was watching him closely, and Jack knew she had seen the change in him. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about taking down a criminal empire. And Jack wasn't going to stop until he did. The bikers rode through the night, the road stretching out ahead of them as Jack led the way. The engines of their motorcycles roared in unison, a sound that filled the night air with power and purpose. Jack's mind raced as he thought about everything that had happened. They had gotten closer to uncovering Viper's plan, but there was still so much they didn't know. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing that every decision from here on out could mean life or death, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Emily was riding behind him again, clutching onto him tightly as they navigated the winding roads. Jack could feel her tense every time they hit a bump, but he knew she was strong. She had proven that over the past few days. She had faced more than most adults ever would, and yet, she was still standing. Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward her. She was caught up in something far bigger than she could have imagined, and now, it was his job to make sure she didn't get lost in it. They passed through small towns and deserted highways, staying out of sight, avoiding the authorities as best they could. Jack kept an eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of being followed. The last thing they needed was the law on their tail, especially with everything that was happening. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Jack signaled for the crew to slow down. They were getting close to their destination, and he wanted to make sure they weren't being followed. The last thing they needed was to walk right into another trap. He led them down a side street, the sounds of their engines fading as they approached a quiet alley. It was a small, nondescript building, tucked away from the busy streets. It was the perfect place to lay low for a while, but it also meant they were getting close to whatever Viper and his crew were planning. Jack dismounted his bike, signaling for the others to do the same. They moved quickly, silently, and Jack could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "Stay sharp," Jack whispered to the crew. "We don't know what's waiting inside, but we can't afford to be caught off guard." The bikers nodded, each of them ready for whatever was about to come. They moved toward the door, keeping to the shadows, their footsteps barely making a sound. Jack's hand hovered near the knife at his side, his senses on high alert. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was coming next. As they reached the door, Jack motioned for them to stop. He could hear voices coming from inside, muffled but clearly audible. He glanced at the bikers around him, signaling for them to stay low. They waited, listening to the conversation inside. Jack's heart raced as he tried to make out what was being said. He could hear Viper's voice, cold and calculating, and it sent a shiver down his spine. "He's here," Jack muttered. "He's planning something. We need to act fast." He reached for the door handle, pushing it open slowly. The door creaked as it moved, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. The room inside was dark, but Jack could make out the figures of men gathered around a large table. There were several people, all of them dressed in dark clothing, and they were talking in hushed tones. Viper stood at the head of the table, his back to them. Jack's gaze narrowed as he studied the scene before him. This was it. They had finally caught up with him. Jack stepped into the room, his boots making a soft thud as he entered. The sound of his footsteps was enough to draw the attention of the men at the table. They turned, their eyes locking onto him, and the tension in the air escalated instantly. Viper's cold eyes met Jack's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "I've been waiting for you, Jack," Viper said, his voice low and filled with menace. "You think you can stop this? You're too late." Jack didn't flinch. He knew Viper was trying to provoke him, but he wasn't going to let him get under his skin. "I'm not here to play games, Viper," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "This ends now." The room was silent, the air thick with the unspoken tension between them. Viper's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do. Jack could feel their fear. They knew Viper's empire was on the line, but they also knew they couldn't take on the bikers. Viper, however, remained unfazed. "You really think you've got this all figured out, don't you, Jack?" Viper sneered. "You're playing in a league you'll never understand." Jack's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife, but he didn't make a move. "Not yet. You're not getting away with this," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not this time." Viper chuckled darkly. "You think you can take me down? You don't even know what's coming. You're too small for this world, Jack. You'll never make it out alive." The bikers stood tall behind Jack, their presence a wall of unwavering strength. But Jack knew it wasn't just about the bikers. It was about putting an end to everything Viper represented. Viper's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Jack could see the fear starting to creep into his eyes. "I'm done talking," Jack said, his voice filled with finality. "We end this now." Without another word, the room erupted into chaos. The bikers moved into action, their movements swift and deadly. Viper's men rushed toward them, but they were no match for the speed and precision of the bikers. Jack didn't waste time. He made his way straight to Viper, his eyes locked on him. This was the moment, the end of it all. Jack lunged forward, his knife glinting in the dim light. But just as he reached Viper, the room exploded in a burst of gunfire, the shots echoing in the enclosed space. The room erupted in chaos. Gunfire rang out, the sharp sound slicing through the air, echoing in the dimly lit warehouse. Jack dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the barrage of bullets aimed at him. His heart pounded in his chest as he hit the ground, rolling behind an old metal crate for cover. He could hear the bikers moving, taking positions, their engines revving in the distance as they fought back against Viper's men. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled the air, mingling with the dust and rust that permeated the old building. Jack's mind was focused. He knew the next few moments could determine everything. Viper's men had drawn guns, but they were disorganized. Jack's crew was trained, disciplined, and ready for whatever came next. Jack peeked over the crate, scanning the room for Viper. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Viper's figure duck behind a steel beam. Viper was fast, but Jack was faster. He knew this was the moment to end it all. He motioned to the bikers, signaling them to move forward. "On me," he whispered into the radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. The bikers spread out, moving quickly and quietly, their training kicking in as they advanced toward Viper's men. The gunfire continued, but it was no longer a chaotic frenzy. The bikers had regained control. Jack moved toward Viper, his knife gleaming in the low light. He could see the fear in Viper's eyes as he emerged from behind the beam, his gun raised, aiming for Jack. But Jack was already there, closing the distance. Viper fired, but Jack was faster, dodging to the side and grabbing Viper's wrist, forcing the gun out of his hand. They struggled for a moment, but Jack's strength won out. He slammed Viper against the wall, the sound of metal scraping against concrete filling the room. "It's over," Jack said, his voice cold, as he pinned Viper's arms. Viper spat in his face, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've got people everywhere." Jack's grip tightened. "You're done," he said, his voice low and final. "You're going to pay for everything you've done." As Jack held Viper in place, one of the bikers, a woman with dark hair and a fierce demeanor, moved toward the group of Viper's men, her gun drawn. She fired a shot, taking down one of Viper's associates who was trying to flank Jack. The rest of the Serpents hesitated, looking around at the fallen bodies of their comrades. The bikers had the upper hand now. The remaining Serpents quickly raised their hands, surrendering without a fight. Jack kept his eyes on Viper, not trusting him for a second. "You've lost," Jack said again, his voice colder now. "You're going to prison, or worse. But you'll never hurt anyone again." Viper's face twisted in a grimace. "You're not the only one with power," he spat. "You don't even know what's coming. The people I've made deals with, they won't let this go. You've made a mistake, Jack." Jack leaned in closer, his face inches from Viper's. "I don't care who you know. It's over." With a final push, Jack forced Viper to the ground, securing him with handcuffs one of the bikers had retrieved from their gear. Jack stood up and looked around at the bikers, who had subdued the rest of Viper's crew. The fight was over, but Jack knew that the war was far from finished. He motioned to the group. "Get Rick," he ordered. One of the bikers moved to help Rick, who had been sitting off to the side, watching the fight unfold. Jack turned to Emily, who had been watching from a safe distance. She had kept her distance, but Jack could see the worry in her eyes. She was still a kid, and all of this had been too much for her. He walked over to her, his face softening for the first time since they had entered the warehouse. "It's over," Jack said quietly. Emily nodded, her lips trembling. She was trying to hold it together, but Jack could see how scared she was. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he assured her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack gave her a small smile before turning back to the others. He couldn't afford to relax just yet. They had won this battle, but there was still more to do. The Serpents weren't the only threat. As they began to move Viper and his men out of the warehouse, Jack's phone buzzed. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of his contacts. "Viper's not the only player," the message read. "There's more, Jack. You need to move fast." Jack's heart sank. The battle had just begun, and the real fight was only starting. He turned to his crew. "We're not done," Jack said, his voice firm. "We finish this now. We take down every last one of them, or they'll come after us again." The bikers nodded, ready to go. Emily stayed close to Jack as they walked out of the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. They had stopped Viper, but Jack knew there was more ahead, and they were going to face it together, no matter what. The morning after the battle, the bikers gathered in the small, quiet town, their bikes parked neatly around the old, dilapidated building they had claimed as their temporary base. Jack stood outside, staring into the distance, his thoughts racing. They had won the fight against Viper and his men, but Jack knew the war wasn't over. Viper's empire was still out there, a shadow that hung over everything they had fought for. Emily was sitting nearby, her legs crossed, her eyes focused on the horizon. She looked tired, but there was a calmness about her now, a quiet strength that Jack had seen growing in her over the past few days. She had gone through more than any child should have to, but somehow, she was still standing. She was stronger than most adults he knew. Jack walked over to her and sat down beside her. "You okay?" he asked softly. Emily looked up at him, her eyes clear, but there was a sadness there too, something that had been lingering ever since the Serpents had come into their lives. "I think so," she replied quietly. "But what happens now?" Jack sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. He had been asking himself the same question since they'd left the warehouse. "We keep moving forward," he said finally. "We finish what we started. Viper's down, but his people are still out there. We can't stop until we know for sure that they won't hurt anyone else." Emily nodded, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. "Are we going to stop them all?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack paused for a moment, then nodded. "We're going to do everything we can, but we can't do it alone." He looked over at his crew, who were gathered around, talking in low voices, checking their gear, making plans. Jack knew that they were ready, but he also knew that the road ahead was going to be long and dangerous. But they weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for people like Emily, people who had been caught in the crossfire. People who didn't deserve the chaos that had come crashing into their lives. We've got family, Jack continued, his voice steady. And we've got each other. That's all we need. Emily's eyes softened as she looked up at him. Thank you, Jack. For everything. Jack smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. You don't need to thank me, he said, his voice warm. You've been stronger than any of us. You're the one who kept us going. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. I'm just glad I'm not alone, she said, her voice small. Jack's heart tightened at her words. He had promised her, and he wasn't going to let her down. He would make sure that she never had to face this alone again. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. All right, he said, his voice taking on the tone of leadership that had carried them through so much already. It's time to take the fight to them. We'll find out where Viper's people are hiding, and we'll finish this once and for all. The bikers stood up, their faces hard with determination. They weren't scared. They had been through worse. They knew the risks, but they also knew that they couldn't stop now. The Serpents had to be stopped. Jack looked over at Rick, who was standing a little apart from the group, still recovering, but looking stronger. Rick gave him a nod of acknowledgement. You ready for this? Jack asked, walking over to him. Rick gave a faint, but resolute smile. I've been ready, he said, his voice rough but steady. Let's end this. Jack clapped him on the back. You're with us now. We finished this together. As the bikers geared up, Jack's mind raced with the plans they had to put in motion. They had learned the locations of some of the Serpents' hideouts from their interrogation of Viper's men. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They knew that Viper wasn't working alone, and his associates were just as dangerous. They couldn't let them slip through the cracks. As the bikers revved their engines, Jack felt the weight of the situation sink in. They were heading into unknown territory, and the odds weren't exactly in their favor. But they had no choice. They couldn't turn back. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with obstacles and more enemies. But with every mile they traveled, with every battle they fought, they were getting closer to ending Viper's reign of terror. Emily climbed onto the back of Jack's bike, her grip tight as she held on. Jack looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening. You sure you're ready for this? He asked. Emily nodded firmly, her face set with determination. I'm ready, she said. Jack smiled, feeling a surge of pride for her. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a survivor. All right then, Jack said, his voice low but resolute. Let's finish this. With that, the bikers hit the road, their engines roaring as they sped off into the night. The fight wasn't over, but Jack knew that together, they would face whatever came next. They were ready for it, and they were going to make sure that no one else would ever have to go through what Emily had. They were going to stop the Serpents, once and for all.